Clara Whitmore slammed the crumpled eviction notice onto the kitchen table and looked the man standing at her gate dead in the eyes. "I don't need a worker," she said, her voice steady as iron. "I need a husband." The cowboy blinked. His hat was still in his hands. His boots were still muddy from the road. He hadn't even introduced himself yet. And this woman, this widow standing alone on land 3 powerful men wanted to take, had just asked him to marry her. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Whitmore had not slept in 31 hours. She knew this because she had counted them. Every hour she lay in that bed staring at the ceiling of the room she used to share with her husband, she counted. It was something to do instead of crying. She was done crying. She told herself that on the morning after Robert's funeral 3 years ago, and she had kept that promise every single day since. But last night was different. Last night, someone had cut her north fence line again. She found it just before dark. 3 sections of good cedar rail snapped clean through the cuts. Too sharp to be weather, too precise to be an animal. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. Cut it there, and her cattle would drift north into open land, cross the creek boundary, and the moment they crossed that line, Blackwater Cattle Company had every legal right to claim them as strays. She had spent 4 hours in the dark alone with a lantern and a hammer, and borrowed wire fixing what someone else had broken. Her hands were still raw. One knuckle was still bleeding where the wire had caught her. And now it was barely past 6 in the morning, and she was standing in her kitchen, looking at a piece of paper that had been nailed to her front door sometime in the night. She didn't know when. She didn't know how they had gotten close enough to nail something to her door without her hearing it. That scared her more than the paper itself. But she read it anyway because Clara Whitmore had made a rule about fear a long time ago. You could feel it. You just couldn't let it make your decisions. The letter was short. It was always short with men like Harlan Briggs. He didn't waste words because he didn't believe he needed to. He had lawyers and money and a railroad contract and half the county sheriff's office in his pocket. Why would he bother with long explanations? Mrs. Whitmore, it said. Our final offer of $3,400 for the Whitmore property and water rights stands until the 1st of the month. Should you fail to respond, we will be forced to pursue alternative legal remedies for the encroachment dispute filed against your cattle operation in September. We trust you will make the sensible choice. Sincerely, Harlan J. Briggs, Blackwater Cattle Company. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box on the shelf above the stove where she kept every letter she had ever received from Briggs. There were 11 of them now. This was the 12th. $3,400. Her husband had built this ranch with borrowed money and 10 years of labor and blood, and she was supposed to hand it over for $3,400. She pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. Not today, she said to the empty kitchen. Not today, and not on the 1st of the month, and not ever. The only problem was, she didn't know how to stop it. People in Red Creek respected Clara Whitmore the way they respected a fast-moving river, from a safe distance. They admired what she had done. Everyone said so. A woman alone running 30 head of cattle managing water rights, keeping a ranch alive through 2 dry summers and 1 brutal winter. It was something people talked about in admiring tones at the general store and the church steps. But admiration doesn't fix fence posts. Admiration doesn't scare off men who want your water. The truth was, Clara had been managing, not thriving. Managing. Every month, she looked at the numbers, and every month, the numbers told the same story. Enough. Barely enough. And now, with the encroachment dispute, Briggs had filed a ridiculous manufactured dispute about 6 feet of grazing boundary that his own surveyors had drawn wrong. She was going to need legal help she could not afford. Her brother James had offered twice to come out from Cheyenne. She had told him no twice. Not because she was proud. She was proud, but that wasn't it. It was because James had 3 children and a wife and a hardware business, and if he came to stand beside her, Briggs's men would find a way to make him pay for it. She had seen how Briggs worked. He didn't just go after the land. He went after everyone connected to it. So she stood alone, and she was good at it. She had learned to be good at it. But last night, kneeling in the dark with bleeding knuckles and a broken fence line, she had let herself think something she usually kept locked away. I can't do this by myself much longer. She had thought it, and she had hated herself for thinking it, and then she had stood up and finished fixing the fence because thinking it didn't change what needed to be done. But the thought was still there in the morning. It was still there when she saw the letter. It was still there when she went out to check the water trough and found the gate on the south pasture hanging open, not broken, opened. Someone with a hand and a purpose. She stood at that gate for a long time. Then she walked back inside, sat down at the table, and did something she had told herself she would never do. She wrote an advertisement. She didn't post it at the church board where half the congregation would read it before Sunday. She didn't send it to the Cheyenne newspaper where Briggs had friends. She sent it to the Laramie Weekly, which was far enough away that word wouldn't get back to Red Creek for at least 2 weeks, and small enough that Briggs's people probably didn't read it. The advertisement said, "Experienced ranch hand needed. Whitmore Ranch, Red Creek, Wyoming. Knowledge of cattle fencing and water management required. Room and board provided. Serious inquiries only." She almost stopped there, but she sat with the paper for a long time, the pen still in her hand, and then she added 4 words that changed everything. Must be willing to stay. She stared at those 4 words for almost 10 minutes before she folded the paper and sealed it. She told herself they were practical words. She told herself she was being sensible. She needed someone committed, not a drifter who'd take a week's wages and move on the moment Blackwater started pushing back. She told herself she wasn't asking for anything more than help. But somewhere under all of that, in a place she didn't look at too often, she knew those 4 words meant something else. She wasn't just looking for a worker. She was looking for someone who would choose to stay. Thomas Reed arrived on a Tuesday. He had been riding for 3 days from a failed job in Casper, where a rancher named Hutchins had let him go without pay, claiming the season's work wasn't worth what they'd agreed. Thomas had considered arguing. He had a contract, technically a handshake agreement, the kind that meant something to honest men and nothing in a courtroom. He had looked at Hutchins, standing on the porch of his very large house, with his arms crossed, and he had made a decision he always made in moments like that. He let it go. Not because he was weak, because he had learned over 15 years of moving from ranch to ranch across Wyoming and Colorado and Kansas that some fights cost more than they were worth. You couldn't win every battle with a man who owned the land you were standing on. Sometimes you just had to walk away and find somewhere else to be. The problem was Thomas Reed was 36 years old, and he was running out of somewhere else's. He had seen the Whitmore advertisement in a torn page of the Laramie Weekly that someone had left behind at a way station. He almost didn't read it. Ranch hand work was ranch hand work. He could find it anywhere. But something made him read it again. Must be willing to stay. He had read that 3 times. He didn't know why it stopped him. He wasn't in the business of staying. Staying meant getting attached. Staying meant caring what happened. And every time Thomas Reed had gotten attached to a piece of land or a job or a group of people, something had happened to remind him why he shouldn't. But he tucked the advertisement into his jacket pocket, and he rode toward Red Creek. He arrived just after 7 in the morning. The ranch was smaller than he expected, but tighter than that whoever managed this place kept it with intention. He could see that immediately. The barn needed paint, but it was structurally sound. The water trough was properly placed. The cattle he could see in the south pasture were healthy. Whoever ran this operation knew what they were doing. He pulled up at the gate and called out, "Hello, the house." The woman who appeared in the doorway was not what he expected either. He didn't know exactly what he expected. The advertisement had said Mrs. Whitmore, but that told you very little. He supposed he expected someone older, someone visibly worn down. 3 years alone on a frontier ranch usually did visible things to a person. Clara Whitmore was not visibly worn down. She was carrying a hammer, which he noticed first because of the confidence with which she carried it. Not as a weapon. As a tool she had just been using, which she hadn't bothered to put down when a stranger called at her gate because she had more important things to think about. She walked toward him without rushing. She looked him over the way someone looks at a horse they're considering buying, not unkindly, but thoroughly. "You're here about the advertisement," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Thomas Reed out of Casper most recently. Before that, 3 seasons in Colorado on the Harmon spread. I've been working cattle since I was 19. She was quiet for a moment. "You rode 3 days to answer a ranch hand advertisement." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" Thomas hesitated. He had not expected that question. "I need the work," he said. "Plenty of work between here and Casper," she said. "Closer work. Why did you ride 3 days?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. Because the truth was, he didn't have a good answer. He had the words, "must be willing to stay," but he wasn't about to tell a stranger that 4 words in a newspaper had followed him for 3 days, like a question he hadn't answered yet. "I don't know exactly," he said finally. Something in the advertisement seemed like it might be different. Clara studied him for another long moment. "Get down," she said. "There's coffee inside." She poured 2 cups and set them on the table and sat down across from him, and she did not make small talk. "I'm going to tell you the truth about this job," she said, "because I don't have time for anything else." Thomas wrapped his hands around the cup. "All right. This ranch is under threat from Blackwater Cattle Company. You may have heard of them. They want my water rights, and they're not being patient about it. Over the last 6 weeks, someone has cut my north fence 3 times, left my south gate open twice, and I believe, though I can't prove it, that they are the reason 6 of my cattle disappeared from the east pasture in September." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's not a range dispute. That's harassment." "Yes," said Clara. "It is. And the man behind it, Harlan Briggs, has the county sheriff in his pocket, and lawyers in Cheyenne who eat breakfast every morning with the territorial judge. Which means that if I fight this legally, I'll lose. And if I don't fight it at all, I'll lose faster." "What are you doing to fight it?" "Everything I can." She leaned forward slightly. "But here's the problem, Mr. Reed. A woman alone on a contested ranch is an invitation. Briggs knows I have no husband. He knows I have no partner. He knows every decision I make, every legal move, every time I ride to town, because when a woman is alone, people notice her movements, and some of those people report to men like Briggs." Thomas was quiet. "If I had a husband," Clara said carefully, "the situation changes. Legally, socially, a married woman's property claim is taken more seriously in a Wyoming court. A woman with a husband beside her when she rides to town is not as easy to dismiss as a woman alone." She paused. "And a woman whose husband stands at her fence line when Briggs's men come calling sends a different message than a woman standing there by herself." Thomas set down his cup. He looked at her across the table. "You're not advertising for a ranch hand," he said slowly. "No," said Clara. "I'm not." The silence was complete. "You're asking me to marry you," Thomas said. He said it the way a man says something he's not entirely sure he heard correctly. "Yes," said Clara. "I am." She held his gaze without flinching. "I know what this sounds like. I know you arrived here thinking this was a ranch hand position, and I am sorry for the deception. But I couldn't put what I actually needed in a public advertisement without half of Red Creek knowing my business before the week was out." Thomas was still staring at her. "I'm not asking for love," she said, and her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that cost her something to say. "I'm not asking you to pretend to be something you're not in private. What happens inside this house is between us, and I'm practical enough to know that 2 strangers can't manufacture affection. But in public, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of Blackwater Cattle Company, I need a husband, a real one on paper standing beside me." Thomas pushed back from the table slowly. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there looking out at the land. He was quiet for a long time. "What do I get out of this?" he said, not cruelly. He asked it the way a man asks when he's actually considering something and needs to understand all of it. "Room and board," said Clara. "A wage $40 a month, which I know is not generous, but it's what I can afford. And at the end of all of this, when the ranch is safe, we renegotiate whatever terms are fair. I'm not trying to trap you. I'm trying to survive. Thomas turned from the window. And if it doesn't work, if Briggs wins anyway? Clara was quiet for a moment. Then we both lose, she said. But I'd rather lose fighting than lose waiting. Something moved in Thomas Reed's face, something he didn't quite manage to hide. He had heard a lot of things in 15 years of ranch work from a lot of different people. He had heard excuses and arguments and deals and promises, most of which didn't hold. But he had never heard someone say, "I'd rather lose fighting than lose waiting," in that particular tone of voice, matter-of-fact, undefeated, like losing was a possibility they'd made their peace with, but surrender wasn't. He picked up his hat from the table. Clara watched him, and for just 1 second, one quick, unguarded second, something close to fear crossed her face. Like she had bet everything on a hand she wasn't sure of, and was watching the other player decide. Then Thomas Reed said, "All right." Clara blinked. "All right. I'll marry you," he said. "But I want to be clear about something first." "What?" He held her gaze. "I don't know your land yet. I don't know your cattle, your accounts, your neighbors, your history with Briggs. I'm not the kind of man who makes promises about things he doesn't understand. So before we stand in front of anyone and say words, I want 2 weeks. 2 weeks where I work this ranch beside you and learn what I'm actually agreeing to fight for." Clara stared at him. 2 weeks, she repeated. "Yes. And if after 2 weeks you decide it's not worth it," Thomas looked at her steadily, "then I ride away, and you're no worse off than you were this morning." Clara was quiet for a long moment. She looked at her hands on the table, the raw knuckle, the calluses, the ink stain on her right index finger from 3 years of writing her own legal correspondence. "Fair," she said. Thomas nodded. He put his hat on. "Where do you want me to start?" he said. Clara Whitmore had expected Thomas Reed to be competent. She had not expected him to be perceptive. There was a difference. Competence meant he could fix the fence line and manage the cattle and handle the morning chores without being told twice. He was all of those things. She could see that by the end of the first day. He worked without showmanship, without waiting to be praised, without the particular performance some men put on when they wanted to make sure a woman noticed how hard they were laboring. He just worked, steadily, thoroughly, fixing things she hadn't even told him were broken because he'd noticed them himself. But perceptive was something else. On the third morning, she came out to find him sitting on the edge of the water trough with her ranch accounts ledger open on his knee. She stopped walking. "That's private. You left it on the work table," he said, not looking up. "I wasn't reading it to pry. I was reading it because the water rights dispute makes more sense if I understand the financial position." Clara crossed her arms. "And what did you learn?" Thomas looked up. "That you're 3 months from not being able to pay the next round of legal fees, and that you already know that." She said nothing. "You're not fighting this to win," he said carefully. "You're fighting it to buy time. You're hoping that if you stall Briggs long enough, something changes, he moves on, or a judge retires, or the railroad contract falls through. You're not certain you can beat him. You're betting that he gets bored before you run out of rope." Clara felt something uncomfortable move through her. She was not used to being read this accurately. "Does that change your assessment?" she said. Thomas closed the ledger and set it on the work table. "No," he said. "But it tells me what we actually need. We don't just need a marriage certificate. We need someone to pay attention to what Briggs is doing and find him doing something he can't explain away." He paused. "That's different work than fixing fence lines." "You're not just a ranch hand," Clara said. It wasn't a question. It was something she was working out in real time. "I've been a lot of things," Thomas said. "Ranch hand is the most recent." She wanted to ask what the others were. She didn't. Not yet. By the end of the first week, Thomas had done something Clara hadn't managed in 3 years of trying. He had gotten Frank Dorsey, her nearest neighbor, a taciturn man of 60, who had watched Clara's situation with sympathy but careful uninvolvement, to come over for coffee and talk about what he'd seen on his land boundaries over the last month. Clara had been trying to get Frank Dorsey to talk to her for 8 months. "How did you do that?" she asked Thomas that evening. He shrugged. "I went over to his fence line this morning to look at something, and he came out. We talked about cattle for 20 minutes. Then I mentioned that I'd noticed some unusual tracks near your east pasture boundary and asked if he'd seen anything similar." Thomas paused. Men like Frank don't like being asked for help, but they'll offer information if you give them the right opening. Clara looked at him. "You're good at people," she said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I've spent a lot of time watching them," he said. "When you don't stay anywhere long, you get good at reading rooms quickly, learning who to trust and who not to." A pause. "It's a useful skill. It's also a lonely way to live." She didn't respond to that immediately, but she filed it away, that word lonely, the way she filed things she wasn't ready to examine. The 2 weeks ended on a Wednesday. Thomas had said nothing about it the day before. Clara had said nothing either. They went through that Wednesday morning the way they'd gone through every morning, him up before her, the fire already going when she came downstairs, the cattle seen to by the time she'd finished her coffee. She waited. She waited through breakfast, and through the morning work, and through lunch, and by mid-afternoon when Thomas was replacing the broken hinge on the barn door and showed no sign of packing his saddlebags, she finally said it. "The 2 weeks are up." Thomas looked up from the hinge. "I know," he said. He went back to the hinge. Clara stood there. "Thomas!" He stopped working. He turned around and looked at her properly. "I'm not leaving," he said. "You know I'm not leaving. You've known it for at least 4 days." She opened her mouth and closed it. The truth was, she had known. She had seen it in the way he talked about the ranch, not as your ranch, but as the ranch, an unconscious shift that she had noticed and not said anything about. She had seen it in the way he'd started making small improvements without being asked, the kind of improvements a person only makes to a place they're planning to be in for a while. She had known. She just needed to hear him say it. "We should go to town tomorrow," he said, turning back to the hinge. "The sooner we make this official, the sooner Briggs has to start recalculating." Thomas. "Why?" she said quietly. He paused. "Why am I staying?" "Yes." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said without turning around, "Because I spent 15 years moving from place to place, and I've gotten good enough at it that I stopped noticing it was a choice. It just felt like what I did. Who I was." He set down the hinge for a moment. "And then I read 4 words in an old newspaper at a way station outside Casper. Must be willing to stay, and I couldn't stop thinking about them." Clara said nothing. "I don't know if I can keep you from losing this ranch," Thomas said. "I want to be honest about that. I think we have a real chance, but I've been wrong before about things I thought were going to be all right." He paused. "But I know I'm the kind of person who should have stayed in more places than I did, and this feels like the place I should have found a long time ago." He picked up the hinge and went back to work. Clara stood in the yard for another minute. Then she went back inside and started making a list of what they'd need to do in town tomorrow. Because some things you filed away in the part of yourself you don't look at too often. And some things, she was beginning to understand, needed to stay there only until you were ready. Not forever. Red Creek noticed everything. A small town always does. It had noticed when Robert Whitmore died, and it had watched Clara in the weeks and months after with that particular combination of sympathy and waiting that small communities do. Waiting to see if she would fall, which would give people something to say, or hold on, which would give people something to admire. She had held on, which meant they admired her and simultaneously stopped worrying about her. And when people stop worrying about you in a small town, they also stop paying close attention. That was about to change. When Clara Whitmore walked into the Red Creek courthouse on a Thursday morning with a man nobody recognized and came out 40 minutes later as Mrs. Clara Reed, the town had opinions. By noon, 3 separate people had stopped into Mabel Hutchins' dry goods store to discuss it. By the end of the day, Harlan Briggs knew about it. Clara had expected that. She had counted on it. What she had not entirely counted on was the particular way Thomas Reed handled the walk from the courthouse to the general store where they needed to pick up supplies. He walked beside her, not behind her. He held the door. He did not perform. He didn't put on the particular show some men put on in public to establish ownership. But there was something in the simple fact of his presence beside her, the way he responded to people who spoke to them, that communicated something clear and direct. She's not alone. It was the first time in 3 years that anyone had stood beside Clara Whitmore in public in a way that meant that. She found herself halfway through the supply list at the general store, unexpectedly unable to speak for a moment. Thomas was across the counter asking about the price of wire. He didn't notice. She was grateful he didn't notice. She blinked once hard and went back to the list. But that moment, that brief, startling moment of not being alone in public, went into the same part of herself where she kept the other things she wasn't ready to look at yet. And for the first time in a long time, that place felt less like a wound, and more like something that might someday heal. The marriage was real on paper. The danger was real on the ground. And Thomas Reed, standing beside a woman who had asked a stranger to be her husband so she wouldn't lose everything, was beginning to understand that he had said yes for reasons that had nothing to do with the advertisement, and everything to do with a woman who refused, absolutely refused to lose. The first morning after the courthouse, Thomas Reed woke up at 5 o'clock, the same as always, and for exactly 3 seconds, he forgot where he was. Then, he heard the sound of Clara already downstairs, the scrape of the cast iron pan, the pop of the fire catching, and he remembered. He was a married man. He lay there in the dark for those 3 seconds thinking about that, and then he got up and went downstairs because whatever else had changed in the last 24 hours, the cattle still needed water, and the ranch still needed running. Clara was standing at the stove with her back to him when he came down. She didn't turn around. "Coffee's ready," she said. "Thank you," he said. He poured a cup. She kept her attention on the pan. The silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had a texture to it. The particular texture of two people who have just done something enormous together and have not yet figured out how to talk about it naturally. Thomas drank his coffee by the window. Clara put biscuits on the table. They sat down across from each other the way they had every morning for 2 weeks, and for the first 5 minutes, neither of them said anything. Then Clara said, "I had a letter from my brother yesterday. James. He wants to come out." "What did you tell him?" "I haven't answered it yet." She paused. "He doesn't know about the marriage." Thomas looked at her. "When are you planning to tell him?" "When I figure out how." She looked down at her coffee. "James is protective. When Robert died, he wanted me to come to Cheyenne and leave the ranch to a manager. I said no, and he said I was being stubborn, and we didn't speak for 4 months. A beat. He's going to have a great deal of opinions about what I've done." "Which part specifically?" "All of it," Clara said dryly. "But probably most specifically the part where I married a man I'd known for 2 weeks without telling him first." Thomas nodded slowly. "I can ride to Cheyenne with you if that would help." Clara looked at him with something sharp and assessing. "Why?" "Because a brother who hasn't met the man is going to imagine something worse than what's actually standing in front of him. Men generally do." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You think you can manage James?" "I think I can be a person who's easier to trust in person than in a letter," Thomas said. "That's all." Clara looked at him for a long beat. Then she went back to her coffee. "We're not going to Cheyenne right now," she said. "We have more immediate problems." She was right. They did. Because at 7:30 that morning, 2 men Thomas had never seen before rode up to the fence line on the north side of the property and stopped there and did not move. They weren't on Whitmore land. They were just on the other side of the boundary, sitting on their horses watching the ranch house, not talking to each other, not riding on, just watching. Thomas noticed them from the barn. He finished what he was doing, deliberately unhurried, and then he walked toward the fence line at a pace that was not fast enough to look alarmed and not slow enough to look uninformed. He stopped about 10 feet from the fence. "Morning," he said. The two men looked at him. They were Blackwater men. You could tell by the brand on the horses and the particular quality of boredom on their faces that came from being paid to intimidate rather than to work. The taller one said, "Didn't know the Whitmore place had a new hand." "It doesn't," Thomas said. A pause. "New owner, then," the man said with a smile that didn't mean anything friendly. "New husband," Thomas said. He held the man's gaze without aggression, without heat, with exactly the kind of calm that is more unsettling than anger, because it cannot be provoked. "Thomas Reed, and you are?" The two men exchanged a glance. "Just checking the boundary line," the tall one said. "It's right where it's been," Thomas said. "You're welcome to note that." Another silence. Then the two men rode away. Not fast. Deliberately slow, the way men do when they want you to know that their leaving is their choice and not yours. Thomas stood there until they were out of sight. Then he went back to the barn and finished what he'd been doing. When he came inside at noon, Clara was at the table with a map of the property spread in front of her and a look on her face that told him she'd been watching from the window. "They'll report back to Briggs tonight," she said. "Yes." "What do you think he does next?" Thomas sat down across from her and looked at the map. "He recalculates. He knows now that there's a man on this property who isn't scared of a couple of riders on the fence line. That changes something for him." He paused. "Men like Briggs don't like surprises. He'll want more information before he moves." Which means we have a little time," Thomas said. "Not a lot, but some." Clara looked at the map. "I need to go to town tomorrow. There's a legal filing I've been putting off because I couldn't afford the lawyer's time. If I bring the documentation myself and file it directly with the county clerk, I can sidestep Briggs's man at the law office." Thomas looked at her. "Which lawyer is Briggs using?" "Henderson, out of Cheyenne." "And the county clerk?" "A man named Pierce. He's not in Briggs's pocket, but he's nervous. He doesn't like confrontation." Clara paused. "Neither do most people when Harlan Briggs is in the equation." "What's the filing?" "A formal response to the encroachment dispute. If I file it by the end of this week, the dispute has to go through the proper legal process rather than the shortcut process that Briggs's lawyer has been trying to push through. It buys us at least 4 months before anything can be decided." Thomas nodded. "Then we go to town tomorrow morning." Clara looked at him. She said. He met her eyes steadily. "That was the point of yesterday, wasn't it?" She looked back down at the map. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it was." But there was something in her voice when she said it, a faint note of something she caught and covered quickly. Like the word we had landed differently than she expected. Like she was still getting used to the weight of it. Thomas pretended not to notice. He was getting good at pretending not to notice things about Clara Whitmore. It was a skill he was finding he needed more every day. The town of Red Creek looked at them differently the next morning. That was not a surprise. Word of the marriage had moved through the community at exactly the speed that small-town gossip moves, which is to say faster than a telegraph wire, and twice as thoroughly. By the time Clara and Thomas rode down Main Street, there wasn't a person in sight who didn't already know. What surprised Clara was the quality of the looks. She had expected suspicion. Some judgment. She was a widow who'd married a stranger after all, and in 1888, Wyoming people had opinions about that. She had expected a certain amount of whispered assessment, women leaning to each other behind their hands, men nodding with the knowing expressions of people who believe they understand something. What she got instead was something closer to relief. Mabel Hutchins actually came out of the dry goods store and hugged her. "About time," Mabel said, which told Clara absolutely nothing about what Mabel actually thought and everything about what Mabel wanted her to think. Old Frank Dorsey, who Clara had barely managed 10 words with in 8 months, shook Thomas's hand on the street with the grip of a man expressing approval, and then said to Clara without preamble, "Good. You needed somebody." Clara opened her mouth and then closed it, because she couldn't decide if she was grateful or irritated. Thomas touched her arm lightly and said, "I think she'd argue with that." And Frank laughed, actually laughed, which Clara was nearly certain she had never heard him do before, and walked away satisfied. "You did that on purpose," Clara said under her breath. "Did what?" "Made him laugh so I didn't have the chance to argue with him." Thomas looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile. "You were about to say something that would have made him like you 10% less, and made our position in this town 10% harder. I redirected." Clara stared at him. "You're very good at redirecting. I told you. I've had practice reading rooms." She filed that away again. Thomas Reed said things like that. Small, almost offhand statements that opened into depth if you looked at them and then moved on before you could follow up. She was beginning to compile a mental list of the things he'd said that she hadn't had time to pursue. It was getting to be a long list. The courthouse was the moment that mattered, though. Pierce, the county clerk, was a small, fidgety man with ink-stained fingers who looked up when they walked in with the expression of a man who hoped very hard that whatever you wanted, it would be simple. Clara put the filing on his desk. Formal response to the encroachment dispute case, number 1182-B. I need this filed and date stamped today. Pierce looked at the documents. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked back at the documents. I'll need to review these for completeness before they're complete, Clara said. I've filed legal documents with this office 7 times in the last 3 years, Mr. Pierce, and not once have they been returned for incompleteness. Pierce shifted. Still, Mrs. He caught himself. Mrs. Reed, there's a process. I'm familiar with the process, Clara said. What I'm asking is that you complete it today, not next week, today. Pierce was visibly uncomfortable. He looked at Thomas again, apparently hoping Thomas might offer him a way out. Thomas met his gaze pleasantly and said nothing. Pierce stamped the documents. He didn't look happy about it. But he stamped them, and he dated them, and he filed them, and when Clara and Thomas walked back out into the street, Clara let out a breath she had been holding since they walked in. He's going to tell someone, Thomas said. I know. Probably by tonight. I know that too. She stopped walking. Thomas. He stopped. Briggs is going to respond to this, she said. Not legally. He'll file a counter motion eventually, but his first response is going to be something else. Something on the ground. Thomas looked at her. You've thought about what? Yes. She paused. I think he goes after the cattle. Not harassment this time. Something definitive. Something that creates financial damage that's hard to recover from before the legal process plays out. Thomas was quiet for a moment. How many head are most at risk? The east pasture. There's a section of boundary there that's harder to watch from the house. It's where I lost the 6 in September. He nodded. I'll move them tonight. Clara looked at him for a moment. I can help. I know you can, he said without a trace of condescension. I was going to ask you to. It was such a simple thing, such a quiet, ordinary thing. I know you can. I was going to ask you to. But Clara felt it hit somewhere uncomfortable the way something hits when you've been bracing against a pressure that suddenly isn't there, and your body doesn't know what to do without the resistance. She turned and kept walking. That night they moved 30 head from the east pasture to the south enclosure, which was closer to the house and harder to access without crossing through the yard. It took 3 hours and a lot of patience, and one moment where a stubborn steer decided it had opinions about direction. Thomas handled the steer without drama, just a steady, quiet redirect that the animal eventually decided to cooperate with, and Clara, watching it, thought, he does everything like that. Steady, no wasted motion, no performance. Robert had been like that too. Her husband, her first husband, she thought, and then felt strange thinking it had had that same quality of economy, of doing what needed doing without commentary. She hadn't thought about Robert in several weeks. Not in that immediate, sharp way she used to. The grief was still there, she'd probably carry some piece of it forever, but it had changed shape. It had become something she carried rather than something that carried her. She wondered when that had happened. When they got back to the house, it was past 10 o'clock. Thomas made coffee he had taken over, making the late coffee without discussion, at some point in the second week, and Clara had let him, and they sat at the kitchen table the way they had started doing in the evenings, going over what needed doing the next day. But tonight, something was different. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. Thomas looked up. "Yes. Why did you leave the ranch you grew up on?" She paused. "You mentioned once that you'd worked cattle since you were 19, but you had a family ranch before that." Thomas's expression shifted. Not dramatically, he was too controlled for that, but something changed behind his eyes. He put down his cup. "You noticed that," he said. "You said you'd worked cattle since 19. Most ranch hands start younger than that if they grew up on a working ranch. You started at 19, which means something changed at 19. She met his gaze. "You don't have to answer. I asked, but I'm not entitled." Thomas was quiet for almost a full minute. Clara waited. She was good at waiting. "My father's ranch," Thomas said finally. "Outside Laramie. 300 acres, good water, solid herd. My father built it the same way your husband built this one, worked himself to bone over 20 years. He paused. "When I was 18, he was in debt to a man named Calloway. Not a dangerous debt, a delayed payment on some equipment. But Calloway was pressing, and my father was too proud to ask for time the right way, and I—" He stopped. Clara didn't push. "I tried to fix it," Thomas said. "I went to Calloway on my own. I made an arrangement without my father's knowledge. I thought I was helping." His voice was very flat. Not emotionless flat, the way a voice goes when the emotion underneath it is too old and too large to let up near the surface. "The arrangement I made was worse than the original debt. I didn't understand the terms the way I thought I did. Calloway was smarter than me, and I was 18 and confident in the way 18-year-olds are confident, which is to say, I had no idea how wrong I could be." He picked up his cup and set it back down without drinking. "My father lost the ranch 2 years later. Not only because of what I did, there were other things, a bad season, some bad decisions that were his own. But what I did started the chain. He knew that. He didn't say it, but he knew it, and I knew he knew it." Thomas paused. "He died the year after we lost the land. He was 61. He should have had another 20 years. He paused again. "I've spent a long time trying to figure out whether men like my father die when they lose their land, because the land was all they had, or because the land meant everything they cared about. I still don't know the answer." Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her. "What happened to your father was not only your fault. You were 18. You made a mistake that an 18-year-old makes." She held his gaze. "I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true, and because the version of that story you're carrying around sounds like the version that an 18-year-old who hated himself constructed. And that version is never the whole truth." Thomas stared at her. "That's a more direct thing to say than I expected," he said. "I don't have time to be indirect." She paused. "Is that why you've been moving? Because you think you'll ruin whatever you stay with?" The silence that followed was the longest one yet. "Yes," Thomas said. And then quietly, "Am I ruining this?" Clara held his gaze without flinching. "Not yet," she said. "And I'll tell you if you start." Something changed in Thomas Reed's face. Something released. Not dramatically, there was no dramatic release with this man. She was learning everything happened quiet and underneath, but it was there. Something let go. He nodded once. "All right," he said. They finished their coffee and went to their respective rooms, and that was all. Just words at a kitchen table at 10 in the evening, too tired to be anything other than honest. But Clara lay awake for a long time afterward, not counting hours, thinking about a man who had spent 15 years moving because he believed he destroyed things that mattered. Thinking about the way he'd said, "Am I ruining this?" with the quietest kind of fear. Not the fear that shows on the surface, but the kind that lives at the bottom of a person and only surfaces when they're too tired to keep it under. She had heard that kind of fear before. She had used to hear it in her own voice in the middle of the night when she was sure she couldn't hold the ranch for one more season. She understood it. What she hadn't expected, what she found genuinely unsettling in a way she couldn't quite name, was how much she had wanted to tell him. "You're not ruining it. You might be the only thing keeping it from being ruined." She hadn't said that, but she had thought it. And she thought it again at 2 a.m, staring at the ceiling in the dark. 3 days after the filing, Harlan Briggs came to the ranch himself. Clara had expected a message, maybe a lawyer, maybe another 2 men at the fence line. She had not expected Briggs. He arrived at 9 a.m. in a good coat with a good horse and 2 men behind him who stayed at the gate while Briggs came forward, because Briggs was the kind of man who knew how to perform confidence as theater. Clara was at the porch when he arrived. She had been expecting something she hadn't known what, so she was already outside, already standing straight, already watching. Thomas appeared from the barn when he heard hooves. He didn't run. He walked steadily and positioned himself not in front of Clara, but 1 step to her right and slightly behind her, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her authority. It was exactly the right position. She didn't know if he'd calculated it, or if it was instinct, and she didn't have time to think about it. Briggs looked at Thomas with an expression that was politely surprised and not friendly. "I didn't know you had company, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "You know who this is," Clara said. "I'm not going to pretend you don't." Briggs smiled. He was a broad man in his 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of face that looked trustworthy and was not. "Your husband, Thomas Reed, if I'm correct. Word travels fast in a small valley." "It does?" Thomas said pleasantly. He did not offer his hand, neither did Briggs. Briggs turned his attention back to Clara. "I wanted to come personally," he said, "because I believe in direct conversation between neighbors. I've had a report about a legal filing made at the county courthouse this week." "That's not a report," Clara said. "That's public record. Anyone can see it." "Indeed." Briggs paused. "Clara, Mrs. Reed, I want to be honest with you. This legal process is going to be expensive and slow and ultimately damaging to both parties. I don't want that. I never wanted that." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable regret. "I made you a fair offer. A generous offer, many would say. $3,400 is real money." "It's not what the land is worth," Clara said. "It's what the land is worth to someone in your position," Briggs said. And there it was, the thing underneath the pleasant voice, quick and cold. Clara felt Thomas go very still beside her. Not tense, still. The way something goes still before it strikes. But he didn't speak. Clara said, "My position has changed somewhat since your last letter." Briggs looked at Thomas again. "So I understand." Something shifted in his expression, something that was calculation dressed as cordiality. "Though I wonder, Mr. Reed, if you fully understand what you've walked into here." "I think I have a reasonable sense of it," Thomas said. "Do you?" It wasn't a question. "You're a ranch hand, from Casper, I'm told. Before that, a few seasons in Colorado. Before that." Briggs paused with the particular pause of a man who wants you to know he has done research. "Laramie, I believe, a long time ago." The air changed. Clara felt it change the way you feel, a temperature drop, a sudden thing physical. She looked at Thomas. His face had not moved. Nothing about him moved. But something in his eyes shifted to a place that was very, very controlled. "You've done your reading," Thomas said. His voice was exactly as pleasant as it had been 30 seconds ago. The control in it was remarkable. "I like to know who I'm dealing with," Briggs said. "I'm sure you understand." "Of course." Thomas looked at Briggs with that level, unreadable gaze. "And what conclusion did your reading lead you to?" Briggs smiled. "That you're a man with your own history, Mr. Reed, and perhaps a man who might find in time that this particular situation is more complicated than it appeared when you arrived." "I'll keep that in mind," Thomas said. And then he looked at Clara, just briefly. a quick, direct look that asked her something. Clara turned to Briggs. "You've delivered your message," she said. "I think we're done here." Briggs looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled again, that pleasant, trustworthy smile that meant nothing at all, and tipped his hat. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed, Mr. Reed." He walked back to his horse. He mounted. He and his men rode away. Clara waited until they were gone. Then she turned to Thomas. "Laramie," she said. Thomas was looking at the road where Briggs had ridden. He didn't look at her for a moment. "He found something," he said. "I don't know what exactly. Enough to make that remark." "What is there to find?" He was quiet. "Thomas." Her voice was not angry, it was careful. "We are in this together, which means I need to know what Briggs might use against us." Thomas turned to look at her. His jaw was set in a line she hadn't seen before. "There's a man in Laramie who blames me for his father's business failing," he said. "Same situation as mine, different side. His father and my father were in a dispute over land boundary when everything fell apart. He has told people I defrauded his father." A pause. "It's not true. But it's the kind of thing that sounds credible when a man who's already powerful decides to put it in front of a judge." Clara looked at him for a long time. "How serious is this?" she said quietly. Thomas met her eyes. "Serious enough that I should have told you before." The silence stretched. "Yes," said Clara. "You should have." She walked inside. Thomas stood in the yard for a moment. Then he followed her. She was at the table with the tin box of Briggs's letters open in front of her, though she wasn't reading them. She was staring at the far wall. "I didn't tell you," Thomas said, "because I was afraid it would change your decision." "It might have," Clara said. She was still looking at the wall. "I know. But it didn't change yours. Knowing you had this behind you, you still said yes." Thomas sat down slowly. "I thought I believed that whatever Briggs could find wouldn't matter if we moved fast enough. If the legal filing went through, if we established ourselves here quickly enough." "You gambled," Clara said. "Yes. With my ranch." The words were quiet and direct and completely without drama, which made them hit harder than if she'd shouted them. Thomas said nothing. Clara turned and looked at him. Her expression was not furious. It was something worse. It was the face of a woman recalculating, reassessing, going back through 2 weeks of decisions and checking them against new information. "I trusted you," she said. "I know. I don't trust easily. I know that too." Thomas held her gaze. "And I'm telling you now. Not because Briggs forced it into the open. Because I should have told you 2 weeks ago, and I was wrong not to. That's the truth, and I'm not going to dress it up differently than that." Clara was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved. Somewhere, a gate creaked. "What is this man's name?" she said finally. "In Laramie." "Calloway. Daniel Calloway. The son of the man my father owed money to." "And his claim, the fraud claim, does it have any documentation?" "Not legitimate documentation," Thomas said. "But men like Briggs can create the appearance of documentation." Clara looked at the tin box. "So we need to find out what Briggs actually has before he uses it." Thomas stared at her. "You're not—" He stopped. "You're not telling me to leave." "I'm angry with you," Clara said. "That doesn't mean I'm not thinking straight." She met his gaze. "Throwing you out now doesn't fix the problem, Thomas. Briggs still has whatever he has, and I'm still in the same legal situation, and now I don't have the one person who knows what the threat actually is." A pause. "And before you say anything, I'm not keeping you here because I need you. I'm keeping you here because you made a promise to stand beside me, and I am going to hold you to it." Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Clara." "What?" "You are the most relentlessly practical person I've ever met." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. "Is that a complaint?" "No," Thomas said. "It's the most genuine compliment I know how to give." The tension in the room didn't dissolve. It shifted, changed shape, became something less sharp and more complicated and somehow harder to carry, because sharpness you can deal with, but complicated things stay with you. Clara closed the tin box. "We need to talk to Frank Dorsey," she said. "And the Millers on the east boundary. If Briggs is planning to use this against us legally, he'll start by building a case that I'm in financial instability. He'll go after the cattle again, and this time he won't stop at one night." She pushed back from the table. "We need neighbors watching." Thomas stood. "I'll write out to Dorsey this afternoon." "I'll write to James tonight," Clara said. "It's time he knew." Thomas paused. "All of it." Clara looked at him. "All of it," she said. "I'm done protecting people from information they need." She said it evenly. But Thomas heard the edge underneath it, the edge that was aimed at least in part at him. He accepted it. He'd earned it. He rode to Frank Dorsey's that afternoon, and came back 2 hours later with something he hadn't expected. Frank Dorsey had seen men riding the east boundary 3 nights in a row. Not Clara's cattle. Not any cattle. Men on horses, moving slow and quiet in the hours before dawn. Thomas sat with that for the ride home. When he told Clara, she was silent for a long moment. "They're mapping the property," she said. "That's what I think." "For what?" Thomas looked at her. "For something they're planning to say they found there." The blood drained from Clara's face. Not from fear, from fury. He could see the difference by now. "They're going to plant something," she said. "Evidence of something. Some kind of boundary violation, or water diversion, or—" "Possibly," Thomas said. "Or they're looking for a spot to drive cattle through and create the appearance of unauthorized grazing." Clara stood up and pressed both hands flat on the table. "Then we need our own witness out there. Someone who can document what's actually on that land before they can change it." "I know someone," Thomas said. She looked at him. "A surveyor," he said. "A legitimate one out of Laramie. A man named Holt. He's honest, he's credentialed, and he's not connected to any of Briggs's people. If we get him out here in the next 48 hours to do a formal survey of the entire east boundary—" "It costs money," Clara said. "I know. Money I don't have extra of." "I know that too." Thomas paused. "I have $42 in my saddlebag. It's everything I've saved in the last 18 months. I'll pay for the survey." Clara stared at him. "That's your money," she said. "This is my land too," Thomas said quietly. "For as long as you let it be." The words sat there between them. Clara looked at him for a long time. Something moved across her face. Something she couldn't quite lock down, which was unusual for her, because Clara Whitmore could lock down almost anything. "All right," she said. "Send for Holt." Thomas wrote the letter that evening. Clara sat across the table writing to James in Cheyenne. They didn't talk much. But at some point in the middle of the evening, Thomas looked up from his letter and found her looking at him, and they looked at each other for a moment in the lamplight. Not with romance, not with anything as simple as that, but with something that was recognition maybe. The recognition of two people who had both made bets that were bigger than they'd admitted, and were only now beginning to understand what was actually at stake. Not just the land, not just the legal dispute. Something harder to measure. Something neither of them had planned for when they walked into that courthouse 2 weeks ago. Thomas went back to his letter. Clara went back to hers. Outside, the Wyoming night was cold and dark, and the east pasture was quiet for now, for tonight, and somewhere in the distance, a man named Briggs was reading his reports and making calculations, and neither of them knew yet what he'd decided, but they were making their own calculations. And for the first time since Thomas Reed had ridden up to this gate with empty saddlebags and worn boots and no particular reason to stay anywhere, he was calculating for something that felt like the future rather than just the next morning. That was new. He didn't entirely know what to do with it. But he wasn't running from it. And for Thomas Reed, that was the most significant thing that had happened to him in 15 years. Holt, the surveyor, arrived 2 days later on a gray horse with a leather satchel full of instruments and the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 30 years measuring things that other men fought over. He was 60, compact, with a neat white beard, and eyes that moved over land, the way a doctor's eyes move over a patient, taking inventory, making assessments, keeping his conclusions to himself until he was certain. Thomas had met him once 4 years back during a boundary dispute on the Harmon Spread in Colorado. Holt had done the survey that settled it. He had been accurate to within 3 inches over a 1,000-foot line, and when the rancher on the losing side tried to argue with his measurements, Holt had produced his documentation with the patience of a man who had been doubted before and found it uninteresting. Thomas trusted him. Clara watched him arrive from the porch, arms crossed, coffee in hand, assessing. "He looks old," she said. "He's thorough," Thomas said. "Old and thorough is better than young and fast for what we need." "How long will it take?" He said 2 days for a full east boundary survey, documentation included. Clara was quiet for a moment. "And if Briggs's men have already been out there, if they've already done whatever they're planning to do?" Thomas looked at her. "Then Holt's survey documents whatever is actually there, which means if Briggs produces something contradictory later, we have dated evidence that what he's claiming didn't exist when Holt measured it." Clara turned that over for a second. "You're not just trying to protect the boundary," she said. "You're establishing a baseline." "Yes." She looked at him with the kind of look that meant she was upgrading her assessment of something. "You've done this before?" she said. "I've watched it done," Thomas said. "There's a difference." "Not as much as you think," Clara said, and walked down to meet Holt. She was good with him. Thomas watched her work the conversation, direct, specific, no wasted pleasantries, but not cold either. She had a quality in those situations that he'd noticed before. She made people feel that their expertise was genuinely valued, rather than just hired. Holt stood a little straighter when she asked about his methodology. He explained more than he probably would have otherwise. By the time they walked him out to the east pasture, Holt was already talking to Clara like she was a colleague rather than a client. Thomas followed 3 steps behind and kept his own counsel. He was watching the boundary line. Specifically, he was watching the section Frank Dorsey had described, the long stretch of fence that ran along the dry creek bed where the land dipped slightly and the sightlines from the house were blocked. He had ridden it twice in the last 48 hours. He had found nothing yet. But the fact that he'd found nothing yet was itself information. It meant Briggs's men hadn't moved yet. It meant they were still planning. It meant there was still time. He just didn't know how much. Holt began setting up his instruments. Clara went back to the house. Thomas stayed not because Holt needed supervision, but because something in his gut was telling him not to leave that section of fence line unwatched. He was right. At 11:30 in the morning, he saw the rider. Not on Whitmore land, just outside the boundary 300 yards east, moving slow. One man. No cattle with him. No obvious purpose. But he was moving parallel to the fence line. And he wasn't in a hurry, and he was looking at the ground more than a man on an innocent ride would look at the ground. Thomas watched him for a while without doing anything. The rider eventually noticed Holt's equipment. He stopped. He sat on his horse for a long moment. Then he turned and rode back the direction he'd come from faster than he'd arrived. Thomas walked over to Holt. "How long to document this section right here?" Holt looked up. "I need about 4 more hours for this segment." "Good," Thomas said. "Don't rush." He rode back to the house. Clara was in the kitchen when he came in. She read his face before he said anything. "What happened?" "One of Briggs's men was watching Holt work," Thomas said. "He left when he saw the survey equipment, which means Briggs knows now that we're documenting. Which means he has to decide whether to move before Holt finishes or wait." "Yes." Clara set down the dish she was holding. "If he moves before Holt finishes, he risks the survey catching whatever he places. If he waits, the baseline is established and anything he introduces later is provably new." "That's the bind we've put him in," Thomas said. Clara was quiet for a moment. "He's going to be angry." "Very. Angry men make mistakes." "Sometimes," Thomas said. "And sometimes angry men with money and connections just get more aggressive." He paused. "We need to be ready for both." That afternoon, James Whitmore arrived from Cheyenne. He had not sent word ahead of time, which told Thomas that Clara's letter had alarmed him enough that he'd ridden out before he had the patience to write back. He was 34, 2 years younger than his sister, with Clara's same dark eyes and her same quality of directness. But where Clara's directness was controlled and precise, James's was the kind that came out fast and ran hot. He pulled up to the gate and looked at Thomas with the expression of a man arriving at a situation he already has opinions about. "You're Reed," he said. "I am," Thomas said. "James Whitmore, I'd guess." "Where's my sister?" "Inside. She was expecting you, but maybe not today. I didn't want to give her time to prepare a presentation." James dismounted. He looked Thomas over in the way men do when they're trying to figure out exactly what kind of threat they're looking at. "I have questions for you." "I'd expect so," Thomas said. They went inside. Clara was at the table. She stood when James came in, and for a moment they looked at each other with the complicated expression of siblings who love each other and have conflicting habits of stubbornness. And then James crossed the room and hugged her hard, and Clara led him briefly before stepping back into the version of herself that ran a ranch. "You should have told me sooner," James said. "I told you as soon as I needed to," Clara said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it. James looked at Thomas again. "You've been here how long?" "Almost 3 weeks," Thomas said. "And you married my sister in that time." "We married each other," Clara said. "I asked him." "I'd like you to remember that when you're working up to whatever you're about to say." James turned to her. "Clara, he's a stranger." "He was 3 weeks ago. He's less of one now." "That's not the James." Her voice was quiet, but it had the quality of a door closing. "I know what you're worried about. You're worried that I acted in desperation and made a decision I'll regret, and that now there's a man in my house with legal claim to my property who I barely know." She paused. "Those are fair worries. They're not what happened, but they're fair. So let me explain what actually happened, and then you can ask me whatever you need to ask." She explained it with the same precision she used on legal documents. No embellishment, no defense, just facts in order. The threat from Briggs, the assessment of her legal position, the advertisement, Thomas's 2-week agreement, the courthouse, the filing, Briggs's visit, the Laramie complication. James listened. His expression moved through several versions of itself during the telling. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And Reed's history in Laramie. What he told you Briggs might use. You're not worried about that." "I was," Clara said. "I'm less worried now that I know what it is." "Why?" "Because it's not what happened," Thomas said. James turned to him. "You'll forgive me if I'd like to hear your version. I wouldn't expect anything else," Thomas said, and he told it the same way he'd told Clara, straight through, no softening. The 18-year-old decision, his father's ranch, the Calloway debt, what happened, and what he'd believed about himself since. James listened with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and when Thomas finished, James said, "Daniel Calloway's father lost his business the same year as yours." Thomas looked at him sharply. "You know the Calloways." "I know of them. In Cheyenne, the Calloway name comes up in certain legal circles." James paused. "Old Silas Calloway didn't lose his business because of anything your father's situation caused. He lost it because he'd been overextended for years. 2 bad cattle seasons in a row finished him." He looked at Thomas steadily. "Daniel Calloway has been telling a version of that story that blames other people for 20 years. He's told it about at least 3 different men that I know of." The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas stared at James Whitmore. "You're certain of this?" Thomas said. "I know a lawyer in Cheyenne who handled one of Calloway's disputes. He told me the full history 2 years ago because the man Calloway was blaming at the time was someone my friend was representing." James unfolded his arms. "I can get you a written account. Signed, documented, credentialed." Thomas sat back slowly. Clara was looking at her brother. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly, but something close to it. Like she had been bracing for a weight, and the weight had just been lifted, and her body didn't know yet what to do with the absence of it. "James," she said carefully. How long have you had this information? 2 years. He paused. I didn't know it was relevant until your letter. No, she said. You couldn't have. She looked at Thomas. This changes your position with Briggs significantly. If Calloway's claim is discredited, Thomas said, still processing, then Briggs has nothing from Laramie to use. Which means he has to come at us another way, Clara said. James looked between them. The way they tracked each other's thoughts, finishing each other's logic without hesitation, he noticed it. Thomas could see him notice it. Something shifted in James's expression. How soon can you get the documentation? Thomas asked him. I'll send a wire tonight from town. My friend can have something to me within a week. A week is a long time, Clara said. I know, but it's what's possible. James looked at his sister. Clara, I need to say something. She waited. I came out here ready to be furious with you, he said. Ready to tell you that you'd made a reckless decision in a desperate moment, and that I needed to come in and fix it. He paused. I don't think that anymore. Clara said nothing. You didn't make a reckless decision, James said. You made a calculated one, a hard one. He looked at Thomas. And I'm going to be honest with you, Reed. I still have reservations. You're a man I met 2 hours ago who is legally married to my sister and living in her house and involved in a serious legal dispute that could cost her everything. My reservations are reasonable. They are, Thomas said. But you're here, James said, when you could have walked away from this the moment it got complicated. You didn't. He paused. That's not nothing. Thomas held his gaze. No, it's not. The wire went to Cheyenne that evening. James stayed the night, and over supper, the three of them worked through the legal situation the way Clara worked through everything methodically without panic, building the picture piece by piece. James was sharper than Thomas had expected. He'd done well in business in Cheyenne because he thought the way Clara thought, just with different tools. By the end of the evening, they had a clearer map of what Briggs might do and what they could do in response. But maps weren't certainty. Thomas knew that better than anyone. What happened 3 days later proved it. Holt finished his survey on day 2 as promised and produced documentation that established the east boundary to within 2 inches over its entire length. He found nothing that shouldn't have been there. No unauthorized diversion, no evidence of encroachment. The land was exactly what Clara had always said it was. Thomas paid him, shook his hand, and spent the rest of that day feeling something he couldn't quite name. Not relief, it was too early for relief. More like the particular alertness of a man standing in a calm spot who knows the calm isn't permanent. He was right. On the 3rd morning after Holt left, 2 things happened within the same hour. The first was a letter from Briggs's lawyer delivered by hand to the county courthouse, contesting the legitimacy of Clara's original water rights filing on the grounds of an irregularity in the 1879 territorial land registration. Thomas learned about it from Pierce, the county clerk, who sent a nervous messenger out to the ranch mid-morning. Pierce's message read, "The filing has been challenged on procedural grounds. A hearing has been scheduled for December 14th. Your presence and documentation will be required." December 14th was 22 days away. The second thing that happened was that Thomas found the cattle, 19 of their 30 head. Driven through a section of the east fence that had been cut in the night, not by anyone who'd been there when Holt was surveying, because Holt's documentation would show the fence intact, but cut last night after the survey was complete, and before Thomas did his morning check. 19 head scattered across the open land, 200 yards past the boundary, grazing placidly and completely unaware that they had just been used as legal evidence against their owner. Thomas stood at the cut fence for 30 seconds. Then he went back and told Clara. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at him with that expression she had when something hit her hard. Not devastation, not panic, just the look of someone who is rapidly recalculating and doesn't like what the new numbers are adding up to. "He moved them," she said. "Yes, which means he can file a report with the sheriff claiming our cattle crossed the boundary without authorization. Unauthorized grazing on Blackwater land. Which under territorial law, Gives him a legal claim to the cattle as damages in the encroachment dispute, Thomas said. Yes. Clara pressed her lips together. He waited until after the survey. He knew about Holt. His man saw Holt working, Thomas said. He planned around it. Can we get them back before the sheriff is notified? We can try. Thomas was already moving toward the barn. Come with me. We need to move fast, and if we're moving cattle back across a disputed boundary line, I want you there when we do it. I want a witness who isn't me. Clara grabbed her coat. They rode out together. Frank Dorsey, who had apparently been watching the boundary from his own land that morning, bless the old man's stubborn vigilance, was already at the fence line when they arrived, standing on the Whitmore side with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has seen something outrageous and waited for someone responsible to arrive. Saw them cut it, Frank said without preamble. 2 men, before dawn. I wasn't close enough to get names, but I was close enough to describe the horses. Clara looked at him. Frank, you saw it. Stood right here and watched. He spat. Didn't want to move the cattle myself. Figured that was your business, not mine. Would you be willing to put that in writing? Thomas said. Frank looked at him sharply. What kind of writing? A signed statement, witnessed by a third party, describing what you saw the time the horses. Frank was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who weighed things carefully and didn't like being rushed into commitments. But he was also, Thomas had understood by now, the kind of man whose sense of right and wrong was concrete and simple and not subject to negotiation once engaged. I'll put it in writing, Frank said. I'm not going to lie under oath for anyone Whitmore or Blackwater. But I'm not going to lie under oath that I didn't see what I saw either. That's all I'm asking, Thomas said. They moved the cattle back. It took an hour and a half. Thomas and Clara worked the herd, while Frank stood at the cut fence and watched the eastern line, because nobody had discussed that being his job, but they all understood it was. When the last animal was back on Whitmore land, Clara sent Thomas for wire while she held the fence line. He came back with supplies, and they repaired the cut section together side by side, hands working in the cold air, without discussion, because they both knew exactly what needed to be done. It was somewhere in the middle of that fence repair that Clara said without looking up from the wire, Robert used to say that you could tell everything about a person by the way they worked a fence line. Thomas kept working. What could he tell? Whether they cut corners, whether they did the invisible parts as well as the visible ones, whether they were thinking about right now or about how it would hold up 6 months from now. She paused. He said, a man who mends a fence like it matters is a man who understands that small things hold large things together. Thomas didn't respond immediately. Then he said, he sounds like someone who paid attention. He was. A pause. You would have been frustrating to each other. Thomas looked over at her. Why? Because you're both the kind of men who are absolutely certain they're right when they've thought something through, and you both think things through very carefully. Something shifted in her voice, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. He would have respected you, though, eventually. I'm sorry I didn't get the chance, Thomas said. Clara was quiet for a moment. So am I, she said. They finished the fence. On the ride back, Frank Dorsey handed Thomas a folded piece of paper. Thomas looked at him. Already wrote it up, Frank said. Kept paper on me since I saw them ride out there before dawn. Figured something like this was coming. He paused. My handwriting's not elegant, but it's legible and it's true. Get it witnessed, and it's a legal statement. Thomas held the paper. He looked at Frank Dorsey, 60 years old, stiff in the shoulders, stubborn as the fence posts he'd spent his life setting, and felt something that he didn't have a neat word for. Gratitude, yes. But it was bigger than that. It was something about being in a place where the people around you stepped in, without being asked, because they'd decided the right thing was worth the risk. He hadn't been in a place like that before. Thank you, Thomas said. Frank made a dismissive sound. Just doing what's right, he said, as if that were a small thing, which it was not. The hearing notice and Frank's statement arrived on Clara's kitchen table that evening like two opposing forces. Thomas sat across from Clara and James, who had stayed because the situation had moved faster than anyone expected, and the three of them looked at what they had. Frank's statement, Holt's survey, James's incoming documentation from Cheyenne about the Callaway history, the 12 letters from Briggs in the tin box, which formed a pattern of escalating pressure that, properly presented, told a story about a campaign of harassment rather than a legitimate legal dispute. "It's enough," James said, "if we present it right." "Is it enough for December 14th, Clara said. "Depends on the judge." Thomas looked at the tin box. "Who's the judge for this hearing?" "A man named Aldridge," Clara said. "Out of Laramie. I don't know him." James was quiet for a moment. Then, "I do." Both Clara and Thomas looked at him. "Aldridge handled a land case 2 years ago that I had a peripheral connection to," James said. "He's not in Briggs's pocket. He's not in anyone's pocket. He's the kind of judge who makes lawyers uncomfortable because he actually reads the documentation." He paused. "He doesn't like Harlan Briggs." "Doesn't like him or doesn't respect his tactics," Thomas said. "Both, I think. There was a case 3 years ago. Briggs tried a similar procedural maneuver against a rancher in Sweetwater County. Aldridge was the presiding judge. He dismissed it." James looked at Clara. "If Aldridge is our judge, we have a real chance." Clara absorbed that for a moment. "Then we make sure every piece of what we have is clean and documented and presented properly," she said. "The statement from Cheyenne about Callaway," Thomas said to James. "You're confident it'll arrive in time." "I said you were being stubborn when you were being right. I'm not making the same mistake twice." Something passed between the siblings, something too old and too particular to belong to anyone else in the room. Thomas looked down at the documents in front of him. Then James said something none of them had been expecting. "There's one more thing," he said. His voice had a quality Thomas hadn't heard from him before, careful, like he was choosing his approach. Clara looked at him. "What?" "Briggs filed the procedural challenge on the water rights today," James said. "We know that, but I heard something in town this afternoon when I sent the wire." He paused. "The railroad contract that Briggs has been operating on, the one that makes your water rights so valuable to him, it's under renegotiation." Thomas went very still. "What does that mean?" Clara said. "It means the value of your land to Briggs is potentially changing," James said. "If the railroad renegotiates and the new route doesn't require the volume of water Briggs was counting on, then your water rights become less critical to his operation, which means his motivation for this entire campaign changes." "He might drop it," Thomas said. "Or he might accelerate," James said. "Men like Briggs don't like being caught in a position where they've spent resources on something that stopped being worth it. Sometimes they cut their losses, and sometimes they double down out of pride." Clara was very quiet. "Which do you think he does?" Thomas asked. James thought for a moment. "Briggs is arrogant," he said. "He's used to winning. Losing to a widow on a contested ranch would damage his standing in ways that matter to him." He paused. "I think he doubles down." "I think so too," Clara said. She said it without fear, without anger, with the flat, clear tone of a woman who had spent 3 years preparing herself to fight harder than she ever thought she'd need to, and had finally reached the place where the hardest fighting was actually in front of her. Thomas looked at her across the table. He thought about what she'd said at the fence line, about Robert knowing everything about a person from the way they worked a fence, about small things holding large things together. He thought about the fact that he had $42 left to his name, had spent the rest on a surveyor, was married to a woman he'd known for 3 weeks, and was sitting at a kitchen table in Red Creek, Wyoming, preparing to go up against the most powerful cattle company in the valley in a legal hearing 22 days away. He thought about all of that. And then he thought, good. Because the alternative being somewhere else uninvolved, moving on to the next temporary place with empty saddlebags and no particular reason to stay, felt like something he could no longer imagine choosing. Not anymore. "All right," Thomas said. If he doubles down, we're ready." Clara looked at him. She had that expression she sometimes had, the one that appeared and then got covered quickly, like something she wasn't ready to say yet but was building toward. "We need to go through every letter in that box tonight," she said. "All 12 of them. Build the timeline." "Then let's start," Thomas said. James rolled up his sleeves. Clara opened the tin box. And they worked through the night. The widow and the cowboy and the brother who'd come back building the case for 22 days from now in a courthouse in Wyoming where a judge named Aldridge, who didn't like Harlan Briggs, would either give them a chance or close a door that wouldn't open again. 22 days. Thomas had made a decision he couldn't undo and a promise he was choosing to keep. The land was not yet safe. The marriage was not yet what it might become. But somewhere between the cut fence line and the kitchen table and a 60-year-old neighbor who'd kept paper in his pocket just in case something had shifted in the architecture of this fight, they were no longer just surviving. They were building something. And in Thomas Reed's experience, building something was always the more dangerous option, because it meant you had something to lose. They worked until 2 in the morning. By the time the last letter from the tin box had been read, dated, and placed in sequence on the kitchen table, the pattern was undeniable. Not just to people who already believed it, but in the way that courtroom evidence needs to be undeniable to a stranger, a skeptic, someone who walked in with no prior loyalty to either side. 12 letters across 14 months, each one escalating in pressure, each one arriving within days of a physical incident on the property. The cut fence, after letter 3. The missing cattle after letter 7. The opened gate after letter 9. James saw it first in document form, and he let out a slow breath. "This isn't a land dispute," he said. "This is a campaign." "I've known that for 8 months," Clara said. "Knowing it and proving it are different," Thomas said. He was looking at the timeline he'd written out on a separate piece of paper. The incidents matched against the letters the pattern made visible. "Aldridge is going to see this the same way you just did, which means Briggs's lawyer is going to try to keep this out of the hearing entirely. He'll argue that the letters are private correspondence and the incidents are coincidental." "Can he?" Clara said. "He can try," James said. "It depends on how Aldridge runs his courtroom." Thomas folded the timeline and set it with the stack of documented evidence. "We need someone who can speak to the legal presentation. Not a Cheyenne lawyer with a conflict of interest, but someone who knows territorial land law and isn't already in anyone's debt." Clara looked at him. "I know someone." Thomas looked back. "A woman," Clara said with the slight lift in her voice that told him she was watching for his reaction. "Her name is Margaret Voss. She's not a lawyer. Women can't hold territorial bar certification. But she was a legal secretary for 15 years to one of the best land attorneys in Denver, and she moved to Laramie 4 years ago. She's been helping ranchers in the valley prepare documentation for hearings for 3 years. She knows territorial land law better than half the men who practice it," Thomas said. "Can we trust her?" "She helped a rancher named Whitfield hold off a mining company 2 years ago," Clara said. "They called the claim fraudulent, manufactured a surveyor's report, and tried to push it through in 6 weeks. Whitfield's documentation, which Margaret prepared, not only defeated the claim, but got the mining company fined." She paused. "We can trust her." Thomas looked at James. James shrugged. "I've heard the Whitfield case. The documentation was impeccable." He paused. "Send for her." Clara sent the wire the next morning. Margaret Voss arrived the day after that, which meant she'd been on a horse before dawn, which meant she had already made up her mind to come before the wire arrived, which meant she had been watching the Whitmore situation from a distance, and waiting to be asked. She was 52, lean and sharp, with a quality of attention that reminded Thomas of Holt, the surveyor, the same thoroughness, the same absence of wasted motion. She shook Clara's hand, and then Thomas's, and then she sat down at the kitchen table, looked at the organized evidence, and said without preamble, "Walk me through this from the beginning, everything. Don't summarize." So they did. All 3 of them. Clara, Thomas, James laying it out in order, while Margaret listened and occasionally stopped them to ask a question that was always more precise than the thing they'd just said, cutting to the legal nerve of it with the accuracy of a woman who had spent 15 years learning exactly where things could go wrong in a courtroom. By the end of the first hour, she had reorganized the evidence into 3 categories on the table: physical documentation, testimonial evidence, and what she called the pattern record, which was the timeline Thomas had built. She tapped the pattern record. "This is your strongest piece," she said. "Not the survey. Not even Dorsey's statement, though that's critical. This timeline is what makes everything else coherent. A judge looking at this doesn't need to be convinced of anything. The pattern convinces itself." She paused. "Who built this?" "Thomas," Clara said. Margaret looked at Thomas. "You've done legal preparation before?" "No," Thomas said. "Then you have instincts for it," she said in the way of someone making a factual observation rather than a compliment. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at the table. Something in her expression said she was filing that away the same way she filed everything for later when she was ready to take it out and look at it properly. Margaret worked with them for 2 days. At the end of the second day, she looked at the completed preparation and said, "If Aldridge runs this hearing the way I expect he runs hearings, and if the Cheyenne documentation about Calloway arrives in time, you have a strong case." She paused. "But I want to be honest with you about something." "Please," Clara said. "Briggs will know before the hearing what you have. Lawyers talk. His lawyer in particular has sources. He'll know about Dorsey's statement, he'll know about the survey, and he will know that the Calloway claim is being challenged." She looked at them steadily. When a man like Briggs knows he's losing a legal argument, he doesn't accept it. He finds another angle. Thomas said, "What angle?" "That depends on the man," Margaret said. "In my experience, men who've built their position on pressure tactics have one more move when the legal route closes on them. They make it personal." She paused. "Is there anything personal he can use? Anything between the two of you?" She glanced between Thomas and Clara. "That looks unstable. Anything he can use to argue that the marriage itself is suspect and therefore the property claim is contested." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara said, "What would he need to make that argument?" "Witnesses. People in this community who testify that the marriage appears to be one of convenience rather than legitimate union." Margaret's voice was factual, not judgmental. "In territorial court, a marriage of obvious convenience can be challenged. It doesn't invalidate the property claim automatically, but it creates enough legal muddiness that a judge might order a review period, during which time Briggs's procedural challenge could still advance." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Margaret. "He'll go to town," Clara said slowly. "He'll talk to people. He'll try to build a picture." "He may already be building it," Margaret said. After Margaret left, she was riding back to Laramie to prepare the final document package. Thomas and Clara stood in the kitchen, in the particular silence that follows a conversation that has named something neither person wanted to look at directly. James had gone to the barn. It was late afternoon. The light was going. "She's right," Thomas said. "I know she is. We've been careful. In public at the courthouse with Frank Dorsey, we've been consistent. But this is a small valley. Someone will have noticed that we have separate rooms. Someone will have noticed that we don't touch each other the way—" He stopped. Clara turned to look at him. "The way what?" Thomas met her eyes. His voice was steady. "The way a married couple touches each other. In passing. Naturally. The small things." He paused. "We don't have those yet." The word "yet" sat between them. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You're saying we need to be more convincing," she said carefully. "I'm saying Briggs is going to look for cracks," Thomas said. "And right now, if someone has been watching closely, they might find one." Clara turned away. She went to the window and she stood there with her back to him, and Thomas watched her work through something he could see it in the set of her shoulders. The particular stillness that meant she was not just thinking, but fighting with herself about what she was thinking. "This wasn't part of the arrangement," she said finally. "No," Thomas said. It wasn't. It didn't. She turned back around. Her expression had resolved into something clear and somewhat difficult. I need you to understand something, she said. All right, I'm not opposed to the idea of this becoming something different than what we agreed to. She said it with the same directness she used on everything else, but there was a careful quality underneath it, a choosing of words that was unusual for her. What I am opposed to is performing it. Pretending to feelings I'm not ready to name yet for an audience. That feels... She paused. That feels like the one dishonesty I'm not willing to add to everything else. Thomas was very still. I understand that, he said. Do you? Yes. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to perform anything. What I said was about the small things, and some of those small things are just habit. A hand on a chair. Sitting on the same side of a table when someone's watching. Those aren't feelings. Those are choices. You can choose them without pretending anything. Clara looked at him for a long moment. You're drawing a line, she said, between what's real and what's visible. I'm saying you can control the visible without compromising the real, Thomas said. Whatever is real, whatever it is or isn't between us, that's yours. I'm not asking you to give it to Briggs's witnesses. I'm asking you to not give them the ammunition they're looking for. Clara breathed out slowly. That's a careful argument, she said. I've had 2 days to think about it. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, something quieter than a smile. Recognition maybe of the fact that he'd been sitting with this problem and had not brought it to her until he had something useful to say about it. That he had not made it emotional before he'd thought it through. All right, she said. Then we're more careful. Together, he said. Together, she agreed. And she said it slightly differently than she'd said it before, less like a strategic word and more like a word that meant something. Thomas noticed. He didn't say so. The week that followed was the strangest Thomas Reed had ever spent. Strange not because of anything dramatic. The surface of those days was ordinary enough. Work in the morning, documentation review in the evenings. James wiring back and forth from Cheyenne, the documentation from his lawyer friend arriving in pieces, each piece added to the growing file. Frank Dorsey stopping by every other day with some excuse about a tool he'd borrowed, and a look on his face that said he was actually just checking in. The Millers from the east boundary sending a note that they'd seen Blackwater riders twice more, but both times well clear of the property line. The strange part was something else entirely. It was the way Thomas and Clara began to move differently around each other. Not performed, not theatrical, just adjusted. She started sitting across from him at the kitchen table instead of at the perpendicular corner. He started finishing a task and then looking to see what she was working on before finding his own next thing. Small calibrations, the kind that two people make when they start taking up the same space on purpose rather than by accident. He held the door when they left for town together. She touched his arm once in the general store when she wanted his attention instead of calling across the room. Neither of them commented on it. But 3 days before the hearing, the night everything nearly came apart, they were not calibrating anything. They were just in the kitchen at 10 at night, and Thomas made a mistake. He had been going through the timeline for the 14th time, looking for anything that could be challenged when he found it. A gap he hadn't noticed before, a 5-day period in October, where there was an incident on the property, but no corresponding letter from Briggs. A fence cut documented in Clara's own notes that didn't fit the pattern, didn't match the cadence. He stared at it for a long time. Then he said, Clara, this fence incident on October 3rd, did Briggs contact you in any way around that time? Clara looked up from the document she was reading. Not by letter, she said. But he came to town that week. I saw him at the general store. He didn't speak to me. Thomas looked at the gap. Was there anyone else who might have had a reason to cut that fence? Someone separate from Briggs. Clara was quiet for a moment. Why are you asking that? Because this incident doesn't fit the pattern, Thomas said. Every other incident maps to a Briggs letter within 72 hours. This one doesn't. Either Briggs broke his own pattern for a reason, or someone else cut that fence. Clara stood up and came around the table to look at the timeline over his shoulder. She was very close. He could feel her proximity the way you feel heat from a fire, not dramatic, just present. She looked at the gap. I assumed it was Briggs, she said slowly. Who else had a reason? No one that I know of. She paused. There was a rancher named Alcott, 2 valleys over. He'd made an offer on the property when Robert died. I said no, and he didn't push it. I haven't thought about him in over a year. Thomas looked at her. Why did he want it? Same reason everyone wants it, Clara said. The water. Could he be working with Briggs? She stopped. I don't know. I don't have any reason to think so, but I don't have a reason to rule it out either. She looked at the gap in the timeline. If Alcott is involved even peripherally, it changes the picture. It means the pressure isn't just coming from one direction. Thomas turned to look at her, and she hadn't stepped back, so they were face to face at close distance. She looking at the timeline, and then looking at him, and their faces were close enough that the proximity registered on both of them in the same moment. Neither moved. I need to find out if Alcott has had any contact with Briggs, Thomas said. His voice came out even. How? Clara said. Hers did too. James, Thomas said. He can make some inquiries in Cheyenne without making it obvious. Clara nodded. She stepped back. I'll write to him tonight. Thomas turned back to the table. He picked up his pen. He set it down. He looked at the timeline, which was still the same timeline it had been 5 minutes ago, and he tried to think about Alcott and contact patterns and legal hearings. He managed it. Barely. James's response to Clara's letter came the next afternoon. When she read it, she sat down at the table and didn't say anything for a full minute. Thomas waited. Alcott sold his ranch in November, Clara said. 6 weeks ago. Thomas stared at her. He sold to Blackwater Cattle Company, Clara said, at a price that James's contact describes as significantly above market value. She set the letter down. Briggs bought Alcott's land 6 weeks ago, which means Briggs now controls the watershed on the north side of the valley, which means our water rights aren't just valuable to him, they're the last piece. Without our water rights, the entire eastern watershed is incomplete. The scale of it landed like a physical thing, Thomas said. He's not trying to pressure you into selling. He's trying to complete a strategy he's been building for years. He needed Alcott's land and ours, Clara said. Alcott sold. Now we're the only thing left. Which is why he's escalating, Thomas said. This isn't patience anymore. He's close to the whole picture, and we're the last thing in the way. Clara looked at him. This changes the hearing. Yes. If we can show Aldridge that Briggs acquired Alcott's land 6 weeks ago, it establishes motive. Not just for the current campaign, but for everything why he's been running this pressure operation for 14 months, why he's filing procedural challenges, why he moved the cattle. It's not harassment. It's a calculated acquisition strategy. Her voice was quickening, not losing control, gaining it, the way her voice always did when she found the angle she'd been looking for. He's been building this for years, Thomas. All of this, every letter, every cut fence, every missing cattle, it's all been part of a plan to complete a land package for the eastern watershed. Thomas was already on his feet. We need Margaret. He rode to Laramie the next morning before dawn and was back by mid-afternoon with Margaret Voss, who listened to the Alcott information with the expression of a woman who is recalculating at speed and liking what the new numbers say. This is the motive the pattern record needed, she said. Without it, the pattern shows harassment. With it, the pattern shows a premeditated property acquisition scheme. Those are legally different things. What does it change for the hearing? Thomas said. It changes everything about how we lead, Margaret said. She looked at Clara. We don't open by defending your property claim. We open by establishing Briggs's. We show the Alcott acquisition, we show the timeline of escalation, And we let the pattern record prove that everything Briggs has done in the last 14 months has been in service of completing that acquisition. She paused. We make Briggs the plaintiff before he knows the hearing has started. Clara looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Margaret. Can you revise the document preparation in 2 days? I can revise it in 1, Margaret said. Then let's start now, Clara said. They worked through the night again, the three of them around the kitchen table, Margaret dictating revisions, Clara writing, Thomas cross-referencing dates. James arrived at midnight, having ridden from Cheyenne without being asked, because James Whitmore apparently had his sister's instinct for arriving exactly when he was needed. At 3 in the morning, James looked up and said, There's one more thing. The Cheyenne documentation on Calloway. It came in full. My lawyer friend got a signed affidavit from 2 witnesses who were present at the Calloway dispute. The affidavit states specifically that Silas Calloway's business failure was due to pre-existing overextension and that no external actor was the proximate cause. Thomas was very still. It clears you, James said. Completely. The kitchen was quiet. Clara was looking at Thomas. Thomas was looking at the affidavit that James had just produced from his jacket. He had carried the weight of Laramie for 15 years. The belief not quite certain, not quite dismissible, that he had broken something that couldn't be fixed. That his father had died believing his son had cost him everything. He had carried that the way a man carries something he can't put down, not because he hasn't tried, but because he believes he deserves it. He picked up the affidavit. He read it. It said exactly what James had said it said. He set it down. Clara crossed the kitchen, and she did something she had not done before. She put her hand on his arm, not a calculated gesture, not a visible for witnesses calibration, just a hand on an arm, direct and warm and completely without performance. Thomas, she said. He looked at her. You were 18, she said, quietly, just to him. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The morning of December 14th was cold and clear. The kind of Wyoming morning that is beautiful in a way that doesn't care whether you notice. They rode to the courthouse together, Thomas and Clara on one side, James on the other, Margaret slightly ahead because she had the documents and the posture of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Briggs was already there when they arrived. He was standing outside the courthouse with his lawyer, a smooth-faced man named Graves, who had the particular confidence of someone who has won a great many arguments in rooms exactly like this one. Graves looked at their group with the professional assessment of an opposing counsel, cataloging them, assigning weights. Briggs looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back. Briggs said nothing. Graves said pleasantly to Margaret, Ms. Voss, I didn't know you were involved in this matter. Now you do, Margaret said without breaking stride. They went inside. Judge Aldridge was exactly as James had described. Compact, gray-haired with reading glasses, he wore low on his nose, and a quality of deliberate attention that made the room feel small. He looked at both sides before the hearing started with the expression of a man who has seen this particular argument in many different costumes and is not easily deceived by the costume. Graves opened for Blackwater with a smooth, practiced argument about procedural irregularity in the 1879 land filing. It was technically sound. It was also, as Margaret had predicted, designed to be heard before the pattern record could establish context. Aldridge listened. He asked 2 questions. Both questions were about the original 1879 filing date and its documentation. When Graves finished, Aldridge looked at Margaret. Margaret opened with the Alcott acquisition. She laid it out in 3 minutes, the timeline of Briggs's land purchases in the valley over the past 3 years, ending with the Alcott acquisition 6 weeks ago, the price paid, and the watershed map that showed exactly what Blackwater controlled before and after each acquisition. She said in a voice as calm and organized as the documents on the table in front of her, The Whitmore property and its water rights represent the final piece of a land package that Blackwater Cattle Company has been deliberately assembling for 3 years. The procedural challenge filed against the Whitmore claim is not a good faith legal dispute. It is a property acquisition tactic. The room was very quiet. Aldridge was looking at the watershed map. Graves said, Your Honor, this characterization is completely I'm still looking at the map, Mr. Graves, Aldridge said. Graves closed his mouth. Aldridge looked up. Continue, Miss Voss. Margaret presented the pattern record next. 12 letters matched to 14 incidents. The timeline in Thomas's handwriting transferred now to a clean document in Margaret's. The dates aligned, the escalation visible. Then Frank Dorsey's statement. Then Holt's survey. Then the affidavit about Calloway, not because it was central to the hearing, but because Margaret presented it specifically to address what she called Mr. Briggs's attempt to introduce Mr. Reed's personal history as a discrediting factor, and presenting it first before Graves could use it made it a neutralized piece of evidence rather than a weapon. Graves objected to 3 things. Aldridge overruled 2 of them immediately and asked Graves to explain his reasoning on the 3rd, which Graves was unable to do to Aldridge's evident satisfaction. Thomas sat beside Clara through all of it. At some point, he wasn't sure when her hand had found his under the table. Not for the room. Not for Aldridge or Graves or Briggs. Just for the 2 of them, in the particular way of people who are in the middle of something hard and have found each other in it. He held on. When Aldridge adjourned to consider the evidence, Briggs crossed the room toward Thomas with the expression of a man who is losing and knows it and has decided to make one more play. I underestimated her, Briggs said. He meant Clara. He said it to Thomas as if Clara were not present. Thomas didn't respond. I didn't underestimate you, Briggs said to Thomas. I knew what you were. I just miscalculated whether it would matter in the end. Thomas looked at him steadily. What was I? Briggs smiled. A drifter who needed somewhere to land. You're right about that, Thomas said. A pause. The difference, Thomas said quietly, is that I found somewhere worth landing. Briggs's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. He walked away. When Aldridge came back, he ruled. He dismissed Briggs's procedural challenge as unsupported by the available documentation. He upheld the validity of the 1879 filing and the water rights registered under it. He noted in terms that were measured but unmistakable that the pattern of events documented in the timeline presented by the defense raised questions about Blackwater Cattle Company's conduct that might warrant further legal inquiry. He did not say you win. He didn't have to. What he said was, the Whitmore water rights claim stands as filed. This matter is closed. James was the first to move. He grabbed Clara's hand across Thomas's body and squeezed it hard. Clara squeezed back. And then she turned to Thomas, and she looked at him with an expression that was not relief and not triumph. It was something quieter than both. Something that had been building for 6 weeks and had finally found a moment to come to the surface. Thank you, she said. Thomas looked at her. Don't thank me, he said. This was yours. This was always yours. I just stood beside you. Clara shook her head slowly. That's the part you don't understand yet, she said. Standing beside someone, really standing beside them, when it's hard, and it costs something that's not a small thing, Thomas. She held his gaze. That's everything. Outside the courthouse in the cold December air, Briggs was already mounted and riding with Graves and not looking back the way men like him leave things they've lost. Not gracefully, just gone. Thomas stood beside Clara on the courthouse steps. James was talking to Margaret. Frank Dorsey, who had ridden into town that morning without being asked because he had apparently decided the hearing was his business too, was standing to the side with his arms crossed and an expression of satisfaction so fierce it was almost aggressive. Thomas looked at the road Briggs had taken out of town. Clara stood beside him. It's not over, Thomas said. He doesn't give up cleanly. No? Clara agreed. He doesn't. He'll come back at it from another angle. Probably. We need to be ready for that. We will be, Clara said. Thomas looked at her. She was already looking at him. We, she said, with the particular weight of a woman who says a word and means every edge of it. Thomas nodded. They stood there on the courthouse steps in the December cold, and the town of Red Creek moved around them, and the land that had been fought over and documented and surveyed and argued in front of a judge was still exactly where it had always been waiting, indifferent permanent in the way that land is permanent while the people who love it are not. But the people standing on those steps had just proved something, not just to a judge, to each other, and that Thomas was beginning to understand, in the slow and certain way he understood things that mattered, was the part that would last longer than any ruling. Harlan Briggs was gone from the courthouse steps for exactly 11 days before he made his next move. Thomas had expected it. He'd told Clara it was coming. He'd even told James, who'd stayed through the week after the hearing, before finally returning to Cheyenne with the reluctant look of a man who knows he's needed somewhere else but hasn't entirely convinced himself to go. What Thomas hadn't expected was the form it took. On the 12th day after the hearing, Pierce at the county clerk's office sent another nervous messenger to the ranch. This time, the message wasn't about a legal filing. It was about a deed. Specifically, a deed that Harlan Briggs had filed with the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, not in the Red Creek Courthouse, where Pierce could see it, and warned them, claiming that the original 1879 Whitmore water rights registration contained a fraudulent signature. Not a procedural irregularity this time. Fraud. A criminal allegation. Clara read the message standing in the yard with the morning still cold around her, and her coffee going cold in her other hand. She read it twice. Then she handed it to Thomas without a word. Thomas read it. The fraudulent signature claim was attached to a sworn affidavit from a man named Gerald Pratt, who described himself as a former territorial land registration clerk, now retired to Denver, who stated that he had been present during the 1879 filing and had witnessed irregularities in the process. Thomas looked up. "Do you know who Gerald Pratt is?" "No," Clara said. Her voice was very controlled. The kind of controlled that meant something underneath it was not. "Has anyone by that name ever contacted you? Any letter, any visit?" "Never." Thomas folded the paper. "Then Briggs found him, or created him." Clara looked at him. "Can he manufacture a witness who claims to have been present at a filing 9 years ago?" "He can try," Thomas said. "The question is whether Pratt holds up if someone looks at him carefully." "Margaret," Clara said immediately. "Margaret," Thomas agreed. "And James needs to know today." She was already walking toward the house. James's response came before noon. His message read, "Gerald Pratt, former territorial clerk, dismissed from service 1883 for falsifying records. Currently in Denver. Known associate of Henderson Briggs's Cheyenne lawyer. I have documentation. Will arrive tomorrow." Thomas read it aloud to Clara. Clara set down her pen. "He dismissed him for falsifying records," she said slowly. "In 1883, Thomas said, 6 years ago, Briggs is using a man who was fired for doing exactly what he's paying him to do now." Clara looked at him with something that was almost a smile. "He's getting desperate." "Yes," Thomas said, "and desperate men make bigger mistakes than careful ones. They also cause more damage before they're stopped." "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "They do." James arrived the next afternoon with a leather folder full of documentation he'd clearly been awake most of the night assembling. He spread it on the kitchen table and went straight to the point. Pratt was dismissed from the Territorial Land Office in April of 1883, James said. The dismissal record is public certified copy from the Territorial Archives. The grounds were falsification of registration documents in 3 separate cases, 2 of which involved land disputes in Laramie County. He tapped the folder. The man Briggs has produced as his sworn witness to a fraudulent filing has himself been formally dismissed for document fraud. Clara looked at the certification. "This is admissible." "Absolutely," James said. Thomas was looking at something else. He had pulled a separate page from James's folder, a list of names attached to the Pratt dismissal record. "Who is H.J. Briggs on this list?" James looked where Thomas was pointing. His expression shifted. "Where did you see that?" "Right here, in the original dismissal proceeding. One of the 3 cases Pratt falsified documentation for. H.J. Briggs listed as the party who benefited from the falsified registration. The kitchen went very quiet. Clara leaned over the table. She read the name. She read it again. Harlan James Briggs, she said. H.J. Briggs. She looked up. Thomas. Briggs was involved in the original Pratt case. He's not just using a man who falsifies records. He used this specific man before, 6 years ago, Thomas said, which means they have a documented history together. A documented history of doing exactly what Briggs is accusing you of. James sat back in his chair slowly. If we bring this to the Territorial Land Office directly, not the county courthouse, not Aldridge's court, but the Territorial Office in Cheyenne, the fraud allegation doesn't just fail. It becomes evidence of a pattern of conduct by Briggs himself. Clara looked between them. Something was happening in her face. Not excitement. Something steadier than that. The look of a woman who has been fighting uphill for 14 months and has just seen the ground level out in front of her. He overreached, she said. Badly, James said. He thought we wouldn't find the 1883 record. He thought it was buried deep enough, Thomas said. He was wrong. Clara stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there for a moment, with her back to both of them, and Thomas watched her shoulders and the particular stillness of someone who is feeling something large and trying to decide what to do with it. Then she turned around. I want to file with the Territorial Office this week, she said. Not next week. This week. Before Briggs realizes what we have. Margaret needs to see this first, Thomas said. Then we ride to Laramie tomorrow morning, Clara said. All of us. Thomas looked at her. All of us. Clara met his eyes. You, me, James and Frank Dorsey. Thomas blinked. Frank. Frank was the one who saw Briggs's men cut the fence in the dark before dawn, Clara said. Frank is the one who kept paper in his pocket just in case. Frank has been standing on the edge of this fight for 6 weeks without being asked and without stepping back. She paused. He deserves to be in the room when it ends. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll ride over and tell him tonight. He did. Frank Dorsey opened his door at 7 in the evening with a lamp in one hand and the expression of a man who had been half expecting someone to show up. Thomas told him what they had. The Pratt record, the 1883 dismissal, the H.J. Briggs connection. Frank listened without interrupting, which was his way. When Thomas finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. So he tried to use a fraudulent witness, Frank said. And the fraudulent witness had already been caught doing fraud for Briggs before. Yes, Thomas said. Frank made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. That's the kind of stupid that comes from thinking you're smarter than everyone else for too long. It is, Thomas agreed. Frank looked at him steadily. You need me to come. Clara wants you there. Something moved in Frank Dorsey's old face. Not sentiment. Frank Dorsey did not do sentiment easily, Thomas had learned. But something that was its practical equivalent. Satisfaction, maybe, that the choice he'd made weeks ago to keep paper in his pocket and tell the truth about what he'd seen had mattered in ways he hadn't fully calculated at the time. I'll be ready at 6, Frank said. They rode to Laramie the next morning, all 4 of them. Margaret met them at her office and spent 2 hours going through the Pratt-Briggs connection with the focused intensity of a woman who recognized a decisive piece when she saw one. This changes the entire posture, she said. We're no longer responding to Briggs's fraud allegation. We're filing a counter-complaint with the Territorial Land Office documenting a pattern of fraudulent conduct by Blackwater Cattle Company across multiple years and multiple cases. She looked at Clara. This doesn't just protect your water rights. If the Territorial Office takes it seriously, and they will because the 1883 Pratt case is already in their records, Briggs faces a formal investigation. How long does that take? Clara said. The filing, I can have it prepared by tomorrow morning. Margaret paused. The investigation itself could take months. But the moment the territorial office opens a formal inquiry, any action Briggs takes against your property becomes part of the investigation record. He can't move against you without making his situation worse. Which means he stops, James said. Which means he has to decide whether continuing to fight you is worth a territorial investigation into his business practices, Margaret said. In my experience, men like Briggs make that calculation quickly when the math changes. The filing was prepared by the next morning as promised. They rode to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne 2 days later. James came with them because he knew 2 of the office clerks personally, and because this was his sister, and because James Whitmore had decided 3 weeks ago that he was not going to be the kind of brother who showed up only when things were already on fire. The clerk who received their filing read the first 3 pages and excused himself to find his supervisor. The supervisor read 6 pages and excused himself to find the director. The director came out personally, which was not standard procedure, and shook Margaret's hand and looked at the 1883 Pratt-Briggs connection with the expression of a man recognizing something he had suspected for years and had just been handed the proof of. "We'll open a formal inquiry," the director said. "How soon?" Margaret asked. "The complaint will be registered today," he said. "Mr. Briggs will receive notification within the week." Clara stood in that office in Cheyenne and heard those words, and she felt something shift inside her that had been braced and locked and immovable for so long that the shifting of it was almost disorienting. Like a muscle that has been clenched for months, finally being allowed to let go, and the letting go hurts in a completely different way than the clenching did. Thomas was standing beside her. He felt her exhale, just a breath. Quiet, not dramatic, and he looked at her sideways, and she was looking straight ahead. Jaw set, eyes bright in a way that was not quite tears, but was the territory adjacent to them. He didn't say anything. He just moved barely perceptibly 1/2 step closer to her. She didn't look at him, but her hand found his. And they stood there in the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, on a cold December afternoon, holding on. Frank Dorsey, standing 2 feet away, looked at the ceiling with the elaborate disinterest of a man who has noticed something private and has decided to continue noticing the ceiling until further notice. On the ride back from Cheyenne, something changed in the texture of the group. The urgency that had been driving all of them for weeks, the filing deadlines, the evidence assembly, the racing against Briggs's next move, had not disappeared, but it had loosened its grip. There was room for the first time to breathe. Frank rode alongside Thomas for part of the journey, which was unusual because Frank generally rode either ahead of everyone or behind, depending on his mood, and rarely beside anyone without specific reason. "You've done good work here," Frank said. Thomas looked at him. "We all did." "Don't do that," Frank said. "Do what?" "Spread it around when someone's trying to give you credit." Frank looked forward. "Clara's a strong woman. She's been strong for 3 years alone, and she would have kept being strong. But strong alone has a ceiling." He paused. "You raised her ceiling." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "She raised mine," he said. Frank made the grunt laugh sound again. "Yeah," he said. "That's how it works when it's right." He clicked his horse forward and rode ahead, which meant the conversation was over, which was exactly how Frank Dorsey ended every conversation that mattered. Briggs received the territorial notification 8 days later. Thomas learned about it the same way he'd learned about most of Briggs's moves, through the network of small-town information that Frank Dorsey had plugged them into over the past month. A man who worked at the Cheyenne Telegraph office mentioned to a supply merchant who mentioned to his wife, who mentioned to Mabel Hutchins, who appeared at the Whitmore Reed gate on a Tuesday morning with the specific expression of a woman delivering significant news. Mabel said that the word in town was that Harlan Briggs had called his lawyer Henderson to his office the morning after receiving the notification, and that the meeting had lasted 4 hours, and that Henderson had left looking like a man who had just been told to solve a problem he didn't know how to solve. Clara thanked Mabel for the information and offered her coffee, which Mabel accepted, and they sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, while Mabel talked and Clara listened with the patient attention she gave to all useful information, regardless of the form it arrived in. After Mabel left, Clara came to find Thomas in the barn. "He's deciding," she said. Thomas looked up from what he was doing. "How long do you think he takes?" "Not long," Clara said. "Men like Briggs make decisions quickly when the options are bad and worse. Continuing the fight against us now means a territorial investigation is watching every move he makes. His lawyers cost money. His reputation in Cheyenne is already damaged by the Pratt revelation." She paused. "The railroad contract is the key. If the renegotiation changes his water needs, there's no longer any business case for pursuing us, just pride." "Pride is expensive," Thomas said. "Pride is the most expensive thing there is," Clara said. She was right about the timeline. 4 days later, a letter arrived. Not from Briggs personally, from Henderson, his lawyer. It was 2 paragraphs, formal and bloodless, stating that Blackwater Cattle Company was withdrawing the fraud allegation filed with the Territorial Land Office and withdrawing all pending legal actions against the Whitmore water rights claim. The letter cited a change in business circumstances. It did not apologize. Men like Briggs never apologized. But it was over. Clara read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it once. She set it down. She sat with it for a full minute, not moving, not speaking. Thomas was across the table. He watched her and said nothing. Then Clara looked up. Her eyes were dry. Her face was composed. But something behind her eyes was not composed at all. Something that had been held together by will and stubbornness, and the daily decision to keep fighting was slowly, carefully, and completely releasing. "It's done," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. "It's actually done." "Yes." She pressed her lips together. She looked at the letter again. She looked at the tin box on the shelf. 12 letters from Briggs accumulated over 14 months, every one of them a threat. And now a 13th letter that was the end of all of them. "I want to burn them," she said. Thomas looked at her. "All of them," she said. "The whole tin box. I want to burn every letter he ever sent to this house." Thomas stood up. He got the tin box from the shelf. He carried it outside, and Clara followed him, and they stood in the yard in the thin winter light, and Thomas opened the box and handed it to Clara. She took it. She looked at the 12 letters stacked inside years of fear and pressure and sleepless nights and bleeding knuckles and broken fence lines, all of it reduced to paper. Then she walked to the fire pit near the barn where they burned trash, and she set the whole box in letters and all. Thomas held the match. He looked at her. "You want to do it." Clara took the match from him. She struck it herself. She touched it to the corner of the first letter, and the paper caught, and the flame spread slow at first, and then fast, the way fires always moved when they had enough to feed on. They stood there and watched it burn. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the fire wasn't saying better. When the last letter was ash, Clara handed the empty tin box to Thomas. He looked at it, the same box that had held 12 threats now holding nothing. "What do you want to do with the box?" he said. Clara considered it for a moment. "Keep it," she said. "Put something good in it." Thomas looked at her. She was looking at the ash in the fire pit. "Something worth keeping," she said quietly. "Something that's ours." Thomas set the box on the fence post beside him. That night, James came for supper. Frank Dorsey came too, invited by Thomas that afternoon, in the same way Frank invited himself into things directly without ceremony. Mabel Hutchins had somehow heard about the gathering and appeared with a pie which nobody had asked for, and everybody was grateful for, because Mabel Hutchins' pie was one of the genuinely uncomplicated good things in Red Creek, Wyoming. They ate together around the kitchen table. The 5 of them crowded and warm, and for the first time in as long as Clara could remember, the meal was not a working meal. There was no documentation to review, no timeline to check, no next move to plan. There was just food and people, and the particular ease of attention that has finally actually lifted. Frank Dorsey ate 2 helpings and said almost nothing, which was how Frank expressed contentment. James talked more than usual, which was how James expressed relief. Mabel asked Thomas 3 increasingly direct questions about his intentions toward his sister, which Clara shut down with a look each time, which Thomas found deeply entertaining and was careful not to show. After dinner, James and Mabel left together, James riding back toward the inn in town, Mabel in her wagon. Frank stayed for a 3rd cup of coffee, which was unprecedented, and then stood and put on his coat and hat and paused at the door. He looked at Clara. "Your husband built a good thing here," he said. Clara thought for a moment that he meant Robert. Then she realized from the way Frank's eyes moved briefly to Thomas that he meant both of them. Or maybe that he meant the sentence to carry both meanings at once, because Frank Dorsey, beneath all that silence and stubbornness, was occasionally capable of a precision that surprised you. "Thank you, Frank," Clara said. Frank nodded. He looked at Thomas. "You'll need to reseed the east pasture in spring. Ground's been disturbed too many times this winter." "I know," Thomas said. "I was thinking late April." "March," Frank said. "Before the last frost, if you can manage it." He opened the door. "Good night." He was gone. Thomas looked at Clara. "Did he just give me farming advice?" "That's Frank's version of a blessing," Clara said. "I'll take it," Thomas said. The kitchen was quiet then. The good kind of quiet, the kind that has something warm inside it rather than something held back. Thomas cleared the dishes. Clara put the leftover food away. They moved around each other in the small kitchen with the practiced ease of people who have learned each other's patterns, the unconscious choreography of 2 people who have been sharing a space long enough that it has become genuinely shared. At some point, Clara was at the counter, and Thomas came to put something away beside her, and they ended up standing close, not quite touching, and neither of them moved away. Clara said without turning, "James thinks you're staying." "James is right," Thomas said. "He told me this afternoon that he approves." A pause. "He said it the way he says things he've been thinking for a long time and are relieved to finally say." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it wasn't his approval to give." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "And what's yours to give?" Clara turned then. She looked at him fully, directly, the way she looked at everything she was serious about. Up close in the lamplight, after a dinner with people she cared about, and a tin box full of ashes in the yard, she looked like herself in a way that was hard to describe, except to say that the armor was down. Not gone, Clara Whitmore would never be entirely without armor, and Thomas wouldn't want her to be. But down enough. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what this is." Thomas held her gaze. "And what have you decided?" "I decided 6 weeks ago that I needed a husband for practical reasons," she said. "And I stand by that decision. It was the right one." She paused. But somewhere between the fence line at midnight and the courthouse in Cheyenne and a kitchen table covered in legal documents at 2 in the morning, something changed. "What changed?" Thomas said. He said it quietly, not pushing, just asking. "I stopped thinking of you as the man I needed," Clara said, "and started thinking of you as the man I wanted." The word landed in the quiet kitchen, and neither of them looked away from it. "Clara," Thomas said. "Don't make it complicated," she said. "I'm not asking for anything you haven't already given me. I'm just telling you what's true. Because I spent 3 years not telling people things that were true because I thought it made me look weak, and I've decided I'm done with that." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I came to this ranch because I had nowhere else to go, and 4 words in a newspaper wouldn't leave me alone." He paused. "I stayed because I found something I stopped believing existed." "What?" "A place where staying was worth the risk of what it might cost." He held her gaze. "And a person who made standing beside her feel like the most important work I'd ever done." Clara breathed out slowly. "That's a very careful way to say something," she said. "I'm a careful man." "No," Clara said. "You're a man who was afraid for a long time. That's different." Thomas was quiet. "Are you still afraid?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about everything honest. Thought about the ranch, and the burned letters, and the man in Laramie, he no longer needed to carry, and the surveyor and the lawyer, and Frank Dorsey's farming advice and the tin box on the fence post waiting for something good. "No," he said. "Not anymore." Clara nodded once slowly, like someone accepting an answer they'd been waiting to hear for longer than they'd realized. Then she reached up and put her hand against his face, just her palm, quiet and warm and completely without performance. And Thomas covered it with his own hand, and they stayed like that for a moment in the lamplight of a kitchen in Wyoming, two people who had come to each other for practical reasons, and discovered something that had no practical name. He leaned his forehead down to hers. She let him. Outside the ranch was quiet. The east pasture held its cattle undisturbed. The fence lines held. The water ran where it had always run through land that had been surveyed and documented and fought for and burned and finally irrevocably kept. The tin box sat on the fence post in the dark, empty and waiting. By spring it held something different. Not letters of threat, not legal filings, not evidence of a fight. It held a folded piece of paper on which Thomas Reed had written in his steady and careful hand a list of things he wanted to plant in the east pasture before the last frost. And beside it, in Clara's precise script, her own additions to the list seeds she'd been saving since the summer before, waiting for a spring that felt safe enough to plant for. 2 lists, 1 piece of paper, filed together in a tin box that used to hold fear. Years later, when people asked Clara Reed what the hardest year of her life had looked like, she didn't talk about Harlan Briggs, or the Pratt Affidavit, or the Territorial Land Office. She talked about a Tuesday morning when a stranger arrived at her gate with empty saddlebags and worn boots, and she looked at him and made a decision that felt like desperation at the time. And when they asked Thomas Reed what made him stop running after 15 years, he never said it was the land or the legal victory or the moment Aldridge said, "This matter is closed." He said it was 4 words in a newspaper that he couldn't put down. And a woman who looked at him across a kitchen table and told him the truth about everything, including the parts that were hard, because she didn't have time to be anything other than honest. He said it was the first place he'd ever stood beside someone instead of in front of them or behind them. He said it was the first place he'd ever chosen to stay. The Whitmore Reed Ranch stood for another 40 years after that winter. It outlasted the territorial period, outlasted the railroad contracts, outlasted Harlan Briggs himself, who died in 1901 with considerably less land and considerably less reputation than he'd started with. It outlasted drought and hard winters and the slow, inevitable modernization of a frontier that eventually stopped being a frontier. What it never outlasted was the 2 people who had built it together. Not because they were exceptional people, though they were. Not because they never argued or struggled or faced things that tested the ground between them, because they did regularly with the particular intensity of 2 people who were both absolutely certain they were right and both sometimes wrong. But because they had made a choice that had nothing to do with contracts or practical arrangements or survival. They had chosen each other every single morning, every hard season, every fence line in the dark. They had chosen each other on purpose with full knowledge of what it cost, and they had never stopped choosing. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Not the land, not the water rights, not the legal victory in a courthouse in Red Creek, Wyoming, on a cold December afternoon in 1888. Just 2 people who had found each other for the wrong reasons and stayed for the right ones. Just a woman who needed a husband and found a partner. Just a man who needed a home and found the person who made him understand what home actually meant. Just that, which, as it turned out, was everything.